never tell your child that they can't do something.
Yeah.
Maybe they might find it tough, maybe they might find it difficult or challenging, but
Mhm.
don't let that be a reason why you don't allow them to do something. Actually, finding it challenging is actually a good way for them to build character.
Hey everyone, it's Dr. Janice Castro, your host for Latine ADHD podcast, where ADHD and cultura intersect. As a reminder, this podcast and this episode is not a replacement for therapy. So today is special because we got our first international guest. I am joined by Tumi, also known as the Black Dyspraxic, a powerful advocate, speaker, and writer who shares his journey of living with dyspraxia, a condition that affects coordination, time management, and daily life in different ways. We'll get into what it means. Tumi grew up in a Nigerian Christian household in the UK. And today he opens up about what it's like navigating dyspraxia in a culture that often doesn't talk about neurodivergence. Whether you're neurodivergent yourself or you're supporting somebody who is, I know you'll walk away from this conversation feeling seen, heard, and inspired. So let's get into it. Before we dive into your story, for folks who are listening that might not be familiar, so I have it written here. It says dyspraxia, sometimes called developmental coordination disorder, is a condition that affects how a person moves and coordinates their body. It's brain based and it has nothing to do with how smart someone is. Folks with dyspraxia might seem clumsy or uncoordinated. Things like writing, tying shoes, catching a ball, or even walking without bumping into stuff can be harder. It can also show up in time management, staying organized, or even feeling overwhelmed in social situations. It usually starts in childhood, it's more common in boys, and often goes along with other neurodivergent conditions like ADHD, autism, or dyslexia. With support like occupational therapy or tools for everyday life, people with dyspraxia can absolutely thrive. To me, does that sound right to you, or is there anything you'd add or say differently?
Yeah, so that was a good definition, but there's some things I will add and say differently.
Yeah.
Number one, there's a misconception that it's more common in boys than
Okay.
girls.
Okay.
So, and one of the reasons why we have that is because if you think about it, growing up, um, it's socially expected that boys may be more involved in sports
Mm.
or do certain things that their coordination may be more apparent.
Yeah.
But actually, we know that as people get older, it's kind of like the same way with ADHD and autism. Traditionally, all these differences were studied in white men, white
Yeah.
boys, but
Yeah.
that's actually not the case.
Mm.
So we can start there. I like the fact that you started with coordination and primary skills, but then you brought it out that in this issues with time blindness, um, organization, there's a lot of overlap between dyspraxia and ADHD, for example, and autism. I think 50% of people that have dyspraxia have dyslexia.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of, and a high percentage of people who are autistic have issues with coordination. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of overlap. Sometimes when I'm making content about dyspraxia, some people in the audience are like, "You've just described ADHD," and
Mm.
I'm like, "Yeah." Because there is so much overlap,
Yeah.
it's important to recognize that there's not a medical consensus of what dyspraxia is. So
Mm.
medically, we use the term developmental coordination disorder, so there's a consensus.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the challenges with dyspraxia is that because we've been using different terms, sometimes get confusing in the literature. Back in the day, it used to be known as clumsy child syndrome.
Mm.
And obviously, you know why we wouldn't use those terms. But yeah, just wanted to add a bit more context.
Yeah.
I actually prefer the term dyspraxia
Mm-hmm.
because developmental coordination disorder has three main issues. Developmental implies that you can grow out of it, which you can't.
Yeah.
It, coordination will imply that it's only to do with coordination, which we've talked about, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And disorder implies that there's something wrong with you that has to be fixed.
Mm.
So I prefer the term dyspraxia, and I like the fact that there's no medical consensus. So
Mm.
everyone with dyspraxia can define it how they want to define it.
Yeah.
But obviously, I understand the importance of having a word that has a medical consensus that we can find in the DSM-5,
Mm-hmm.
which which is DCD. So
Yeah.
there's benefits and disadvantages.
Thank you for providing clarity around this misconception,
Mm,
not that it's more common in boys, but rather understanding that the research has been predominantly on white boys, which then leads to this narrative that it happens more with boys. And I agree with you. I think with the terminology, if it's developmental coordination disorder, what happens is that then there's this assumption that, oh, then you can grow out of it, or, oh, it only has to do with movement and being clumsy. When, like you said, a lot of the symptoms overlap with ADHD.
yeah. The
Mm-hmm.
current is high, and I think we
Yeah.
need to get to this point where I think labels have done a really great thing
Mm,
in terms of opening the discussion, but we
right.
need to go beyond that because if you think about it, we have autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, maybe add a few more terms,
Mm,
but we're really using that to describe all the brains in the world. There's 8 billion,
mm,
right? And neurodiversity is all about different brains. Every brain is unique. Every
that's right.
brain has their own strengths, weaknesses, profiles. So
Mm-hmm.
if you think about it, these labels and these terms are actually quite limiting.
Mm,
So they have advantages and disadvantages, and they help us to understand and conceptualize. But we can't afford to put these labels in a box. And
yes.
I'm excited because I think that is where we're starting to have conversations in the neurodiversity space.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm excited for the change that is to come and the work that you do, the content that you provide for communities, for society to understand that these labels might be a good start so that there is some kind of understanding or language that we're like, okay, we get what we're talking about, and not limiting ourselves to that and putting it all in a box, because you're right. We all think and learn differently. I would love to hear and start off with my first question about your experiences. So, what was it like for you growing up with dyspraxia in a Nigerian home, and how did your family respond to it?
I love this question. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 4.
Mm,
So I often say that before I knew I was black, I knew I was dyspraxic.
yeah.
And what I mean by that is that if you think about a Nigerian, but just a general black community,
Mm-hmm.
coordination is quite an important part of our culture. In church, you're dancing. At home, there's music.
Mm,
In parties, there's dancing competitions. You know, as a black boy, you're supposed to be athletic. You're supposed to be the fastest, the best at football. We call it football, you may call it soccer.
yeah.
The best at, good at these games compared to your white counterparts. None of these things could be used to describe me.
Mm.
You know, M- my dad, he used to joke and say, the way you dance, it makes me think, are we listening to the same music? Because I was
Yeah.
just offbeat. And these things used to get me as a kid because I didn't just want to be like people in my class. I wanted to be people like my family, my cousins. I
Yeah.
would never win the dancing competitions. And it's really interesting because when I talk about this fact, I always talk about dance, and
Mm,
people may not realize why, because dance is such a form of expression, culture.
mm,
We dance at weddings, we dance at church, we dance when things are going good, when things are
mm,
going bad. Dance is
mm,
such an important part. And, it was supposed to have rhythm
mm.
and coordination, but I just didn't have these things. But my mom used to tell me that it's good. It's a positive thing because it means that I don't have to live up to stereotypical norms of what it means to be black.
Yeah.
I don't have to be sporty. I don't have to be good at music because I'm different.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that my mom and dad recognized is that because of that earlier diagnosis, clinicians told them that I had above average intelligence.
Mm.
So what they meant that allowed them to be very intentional about the schools that I went to.
Mm-hmm.
So thankfully, my parents had some money, so they were able to take me to private school,
Mm-hmm.
which I think in the UK, maybe 7 to 8% of the country goes to private school. Most of the education is state-led.
Mm-hmm.
But that meant it was smaller class sizes. I was able to get that one-to-one attention that really made
Mm.
me the person I am today. My mom, for a long time, was in denial. I come from a Christian family background.
Mm.
So it was more kind of like, no, my child doesn't do this. Don't
Mm-hmm.
give him a label that's not supposed to be his. Let's pray about it, you know.
Mm.
And faith has been a really important part of my journey. Don't get me wrong, but in the beginning, there was doubt, you know.
Yeah.
But my mom being a pharmacist and my dad, they were really great because even growing up, there were books around the house about dyspraxia.
Oh,
You know,
wow.
I was diagnosed at, I got my diagnosis at 96.
Uh-huh.
And think about it, this was way before the internet and
Right?
everything. But my parents were internet intentional about, okay, let's find out what this is. And that was really good for me.
Yeah.
There's so many other things I could say, but I think that family support and my mom and dad always, especially my dad, really affirmed with me that, you know what, there's nothing you can't do. And that
Mm.
was what my faith was like. My mom used to say things like, the world may say things are tough, but with God, nothing is impossible.
Mm.
And that affirmation was really helpful for me as a kid
Yeah.
because just going back before my diagnosis, I struggled to walk
Mm.
and talk. So the age that in which I did that was far later than what it was supposed to. I think I started walking around 2 or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very clear in my development that I wasn't quote unquote normal. My
Mm.
parents just couldn't get a name to it. And so
Yeah.
that's, because if you think about it, 4 is quite early to have any form of neurodivergent diagnosis. But
Agree.
that's what happened. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing about your journey because as you were bringing up dancing, sports, culturally as a Latina growing up in a Peruvian household, and I think a lot of us from the Latina community is that dance is something that is very cultural. I remember as a kid, everybody danced. You danced at parties, you had music all the
Yeah.
time. And then there is stereotypes, right? While it's part of the culture, then people start to put us into boxes and they
Yeah.
start to assume, oh, well, you're Latina, you probably know how to dance salsa. Or if you're black, like, oh, black people have rhythm, especially when they compare it to white people. And I think that
Exactly.
when you don't fit into that box, we can start to judge ourselves or feel shame or embarrassed that we don't fit into this community that we're supposed to be
Yeah.
fitting into with certain things. And sports too. Soccer is very common within Latin America. I know I grew up watching soccer and I played it a little bit. And yet, when you're trying to engage in these sports that are really popular and it's hard, then it can start to turn into self critical talk of like, what's wrong with me? And I think it's so beautiful that your parents were very open to supporting you in different ways. And I do hear at first it was hard, especially when we think about religion. You mentioned growing up in a Christian household and how your mom had a hard time. There was some resistance and wanting
Mm.
to pray over it and hoping that this label wasn't true. And that resistance happens a lot when it comes to any type of diagnosis, especially when we come from communities where there's a really big stigma with mental health.
Yeah. I think sometimes there's so much to unpack with what you say. I think when we talk about culture and
Mm,
different communities and ethnicities. I think sometimes, especially in the modern world,
Mm,
and we forget how fundamental religion and faith plays in
yeah.
some of these communities and shaping philosophies of how we view things.
Yeah.
And sometimes we talk a lot about the intersection of race and disability, but if we forget the faith aspect,
Mm,
the faith aspect could actually explain some of the challenges that are going on. And
yeah.
I think, yeah, what you said is spot on.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to remember let me leave it like that at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I was basically summarizing what you said and just agreeing with you, like the parallels that come up with our
Yeah,
different cultural backgrounds. Because even as you brought up growing up within a Nigerian household where Christianity is very important, I know that for a lot of us who come from descendants of Latin America, there is also religion. I know, at least for me, I grew up in a Catholic household. And so it gets ingrained in you so early on. And you're right. Like when we start to talk about neurodiversity, yes, there is an important aspect of exploring race and ethnicity. And we can't untangle that history of religion and faith and how that also influences our thoughts, our
yeah,
experiences, and how we
yeah,
interpret these diagnoses or mental
yeah.
health and well
It's
being.
true. And I also wanted to, it was interesting when we talked about rhythm and sports.
Mm,
You mentioned something and it was interesting because you were like, oh yeah, black people or people from Latino backgrounds have more rhythm in relation to white people.
mm,
And sometimes and that's why it's interesting because we live in countries where we are the minority, it's
yeah.
always in relation to
Yes.
in in relation to the majority, and
Mm-hmm.
because we are comparing ourselves to them, that reinforces the stigma, that reinforces the self-doubt
Yep.
as an individual. I often say I've mentioned the fact that you would think that having an early diagnosis is just an advantage, like there's no difficulties. But actually, there were disadvantages. Something I think about, maybe I did do more harm than good. And I say that because dyspraxia was always a reason for me not to do something. For example, don't play on the piano like your sister, because we know that you're gonna find that challenging because you're
Mm,
dyspraxic.
yeah.
Or be careful not to fall. You know you have dyspraxia, and so even though parents want to encourage and affirm because they love you,
Mm,
because they love me not to get disappointed, dyspraxia became a limitation, a reason for me not to do something. To the
yeah.
point that my parents say to me that they describe that if you want me to do something, just tell me that I can't do it. Because
Mm,
that would incentivize me to show you. But because of that, dyspraxia has been a source of limiting doubt
yeah.
and insecurity that I need to do work to unpick it.
Mm,
To actually do work to actually be like, no, that's just a limiting belief and it doesn't have to be that way.
mm,
But for example, if I got diagnosed at 25 or 30, I've lived 30 years without putting a name to my challenges or difficulties. So my relationship with my neurodivergence could be different. And it's
yeah.
different, not necessarily better or worse. And I want to say that because a lot of people then say, oh, we just need the early diagnosis and we will have solved everything. And it's like, no, 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 no.
Mm.
Early diagnosis, but how do we perceive that diagnosis and what do we do about that?
Thank you for sharing that experience because you're right. I think there is this assumption that we have that, oh, well, if you get the diagnosis earlier, then you have more clarity around the support and accommodations you need. And I think that overlooks that experience of being limited by other people, even if it comes from a place of love and
Yeah,
protection, with
yeah,
parents saying, like, because of the dyslexia, maybe don't try this, or let's figure out how you can do that before you even just going into it without thinking
yeah.
about that limitation.
Yeah.
And not
So
also, I just want to correct, like, it's not a limitation, right? Like, I catch myself saying going into it with that limitation, but I think more so like the accommodations that are
yeah.
needed.
So some people ask me, what advice would I give to parents?
Mm-hmm.
Never tell your child that they can't do something.
Yeah.
Maybe they might find it tough. Maybe they might find it difficult or challenging,
Mm-hmm.
but don't let that be a reason why you don't allow them to do something. Actually, finding it challenging is actually a good way for them to build character and learn.
Yeah.
Because in life, you can't be good at everything. That's
Mm-hmm.
not how it works. And
That's right.
actually, letting them encounter that at an early age would actually improve their relationship with failure
Mm.
and the relationship with, okay, this was tough, this was challenging, but it builds character, right? And
Yeah.
so I just wanted to throw out that.
Yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out because you're right. Real life is experiencing failures and being able
Exactly.
to get back up and move forward. And maybe moving forward means you try again or you try something different. So, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think telling a child that you can't do something without even letting them try can create a lot of limitations, but also avoidance of these
Mm,
experiences of failure that are part of resilience.
yeah.
Yeah. So I want us to transition to our last question. Looking back now, how do you think your culture shaped how you see yourself today?
That's a very mm. My cultures, because I'm talking specifically from a Nigerian.
Mm-hmm.
Nigerians are very confident.
Mm-hmm.
We think we can be the best. We think we can strive. And I think for me, that's been quite an interesting thing to encounter with being dyspraxic and having a difference and something that could be a challenge to some. Because it sounds like an oxymoron, right? You're
Mm.
supposed to be the best. You're supposed to work hard and be the top at everything. But at the same time, you have challenges that some people don't.
Mm.
And so working that, it allowed me to become resilient. I have this confidence in the sense that I remember talking to some people who are neurodivergent, and it's like, why do you have that audacity to believe that you can do this? And I think coming from a Nigerian, but even from an immigrant backstory, you have to be resilient, right? You have
Yeah.
because the culture, your country is not for you, so you have
Yeah.
to work 2 or 3 times as harder, dyspraxia or not, you
Mm.
know. So I think that's really helped me. Also, I like the fact that even growing up, because there wasn't an understanding of neurodivergence and disability within my community, people saw me for Tumi. They didn't see the label, you're a son, you're a nephew, you are a cousin, you're a grandson. It wasn't the boy who had
Mm-hmm.
dyslexia. And I think that was really great for me, especially in secondary school where I did encounter bullying because there were some challenges with coordination and stuff. Being in places where people didn't see that
Mm.
was really good for me. And
Yeah.
then also, as a Nigerian, as an African, community is such a big thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't, I'm one of 5 siblings
Mm.
and I have loads of cousins. So it meant that I, I was able to build those social skills that have really helped me because generally people who are neurodivergent dyspraxic, they're not supposed to be social.
Mm.
That's it, not, they have challenges to social skills and stuff. But growing up by default, social skills and being extrovert is actually part of my personality now. I love hanging around with people and have that confidence. And that's really helped me to access the support that I need because since I was 18, when I went to university,
Mm.
I lived away from home. I
Oh,
lived
okay.
4 hours away. Now
Mm-hmm.
I know to my American audience, 4 hours doesn't sound like a lot, but in a country like the UK, like England, it's the other side of the country.
Mm.
And I've always lived quite far since uni, my master's, where I live now.
Mm.
as it is really far, but being able to tap into the African community in those regions has really helped me to be the man that I am today, because
Yeah.
that support is important.
Yeah, definitely. I love how you highlighted those strengths of the resilience coming from the immigrant experience of being Nigerian in the UK and talking about how, because there wasn't a lot of conversations or understanding about neurodiversity and disability growing up, that you weren't necessarily seen as, oh, Tumi who has dyspraxia, but
Mm,
rather seeing you as Tumi, and that diagnosis doesn't define you. And I love that sense of community because within the Latina community, we also come from a very collectivistic culture. So when you brought up having multiple siblings or cousins, I'm like, oh, yeah, that happens to us too. And so you do naturally start to develop these social
yeah,
skills because you grow up with people everywhere all the time in your
yeah,
home,
yeah.
visiting. Thank you so much for sharing. As we wrap up, I would like to ask, what are offerings that you have that you would like to share with us and the best way to contact you?
If anybody wants me to podcast or give a talk to any communities, please contact my page or email me at to me at theblackdyspraxic.com. Or also feel free to engage with me on Instagram or TikTok and LinkedIn under the Black Dyspraxic and on LinkedIn as Tumi Sotia. So that's TUMI SOTIRE, and you can't miss me.
Thank you so much to me for sharing his story with such honesty and heart. Conversations like this remind us that culture and neurodivergence are deeply connected and that every story helps break the silence for others. If today's episode resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Latine ADHD on your favorite platform so you don't miss what's next. Until next time, take care of yourself and remember, your story matters.